Good morning. Thanks for coming. Today I'm going to talk about a story that involves the first man being made of dirt, the first woman being made out of that man, two magic trees, a talking snake, and a flaming sword dancing in midair. Now, how many of you think that sounds like a myth? Okay. We've got 59 minutes left. What are we going to do? The answer is we're going to do the really important thing, an interesting thing. What does it mean to call this story a myth, or any story a myth? And how does analyzing it as a myth help us understand what really happened in Eden? When we do this, we see that the real meaning of the story is quite different from what we've been told. My wife and I have undertaken this task in great detail in our new book, The Mythology of Eden, copies of which are on the table over there. Today, I'll focus on two important points of the story. A myth can be understood on many levels, and I can only cover a little bit of it today. I'll focus on two things, and it's really only the tip of the iceberg. In order to help you understand my presentation, I should explain my approach. I gave the book the title it has because, as mentioned on the quotes on the screen, the Eden story lies within the genre of myth. So, by using the term myth, I'm focusing not on whether it's factually true, but rather on how the story is constructed, which is in the manner of myth, using symbols as its building blocks in order to convey truths. I believe that our understanding of the story can be enhanced and enriched by a greater focus on the mythological symbolism that it utilizes, hence the title of the book. Two more introductory points. Like most mythologists, I take the psychological approach to myths, pioneered by Carl Jung, which is reflected in the quote here from Alan Watts. I recognize that real myths and their symbols originate in the unconscious part of the human psyche. They're shaped by common patterns called archetypes that evolve in all of our psyches. That's why we see similar meanings being given to the same symbols the world over, and why so many myths have the same motifs. The second introductory point is that we never meet 100% myth. In being told and retold, a myth is processed and changed by our conscious minds. Further, in works like the Bible, the myths and their symbols are being used intentionally for polemical purposes. In the Eden story, as we'll see, the original meanings of the symbols have been turned around by the author in order to make his argument. So here are the two topics that I'm going to talk about. The first I like to call Yahweh's divorce, and it has to do with how the author utilized the symbols of the garden, the sacred trees, and the serpent to polemicize against Canaanite religion and its chief goddess, who happened to be the wife of God. The second topic will be, what is the nature and meaning of the knowledge of good and evil in the story, and the meaning of Adam and Eve's transgression. The first topic is more about the polemical use of myth, and the second is more about the pure myth, in a psychological sense. Now, I'll start with some literary and historical background. First, who is our author? We don't know his name, but the scholars call him the Yahwist, J for short, because he was the first biblical author to call God by the name Yahweh. He's our earliest biblical author. Another introductory point is that there are actually two creation stories in Genesis. The first is in Genesis 1, which is the famous 7-day account. And the second is in Genesis 2 and 3, which is the Eden story. The first was written by an author called the priestly author, or P for short. And in that story, the order of creation is first plants, then animals, and then men and women simultaneously, and probably more than just one couple. In the Eden story, however, the order of creation is man, which is Adam, then plants, then the animals created to be his possible mate, and then when that didn't work out, Eve was created. These two authors also use different names for God. The Yahwist uses Yahweh, as I mentioned. The priestly author uses Elohim, which is just a generic word for God. Another important difference in the stories is how human nature differs. The lofty notion that man is created in the image of God appears only in Genesis 1 and is absent from the Eden story, in which humans are not nearly so elevated. In the Eden story, humans are made from dirt, and they return to dirt when they die. And a major point in the Eden story is that humans should not try to be like God, because humans and God are fundamentally different. Now, the historical background. The archaeology shows that Israel emerged from within Canaan in the highlands of what is now the West Bank and spread from there. So originally, the Israelites were really mostly native Canaanites. This means that their own religious traditions were those of Canaanite polytheism. The Bible paints this picture of Hebrews escaping from Egypt in the Exodus and adopting Yahweh as their God in the Sinai, and then invading the Promised Land and killing all the Canaanites. But the archaeologists have been all over this, and there's really no evidence for that. The Bible portrays the Canaanites and their gods as foreign enemies, but the real story is more like the old line from Pogo: we have met the enemy, and he is us. Further, Yahweh was not among the deities originally worshipped by the Canaanites who became the Israelites. He was imported into Israel by groups from the south in a place called the Midian. That's where, you'll recall, Moses met Jethro the priest, married his daughter, and encountered the burning bush. So to that extent, there is a grain of truth in the Moses legend. This is important because it means that the effort to establish monotheism entailed the Israelites exercising their own religious traditions rather than staying away from foreign ones. These traditions involve such things as venerating sacred trees, serpents, goddesses who were paired with their husband gods. And this is exactly what pops up in the Eden story. So now we can turn to the author's agenda. I hope you can read that. It's the first of the 10 Commandments. One of Jay's major themes is Canaanite bashing. Leaving aside the Eden story for a moment, we see this in the story of Noah's drunkenness, where Canaan is cursed. And then Jay lays it out here, more specifically, in the first of the 10 Commandments, which was authored by Jay, same author. Here, Jay rages against Canaanite altars, stone pillars, and Asherah poles, all found in the Canaanite religious sanctuaries. An Asherah was a wooden pole, kind of like a totem pole, that was a stylized tree. It was a cult object of the goddess Asherah, Yahweh's wife, and named after her, and it became her symbol. She was worshipped through the veneration of this cult object. Okay, here are the mythological symbols I'm going to cover. Under the first topic, it's the garden sanctuary itself, and then this trinity, which I call it, of the goddess, sacred trees, and serpent. And you can see it here. This is an Egyptian example, but this is what I'm going to talk about. Here you have the goddess. This is nude in the caption down there. And she's in a sacred tree, and the serpent is guarding both of them. And it's in a somewhat erect posture. Note that, because I'm going to mention it later. All right, here's what I'm going to tell you. Jay portrayed Yahweh as the sole repository of divinity having powers over all the cosmos. Therefore, he had to eliminate and appropriate the powers of the Canaanite divinities. This included eliminating Asherah, whom Yahweh had inherited from the Canaanite god El as his consort or wife. In the Eden story, Jay arranged their divorce and sent the goddess into oblivion. Now I'll go through some of the evidence. First, the garden. In the earliest civilizations, the goddess governed vegetation and life. People partook of the first crops as her bounty and her body, and set up this sanctuary with a garden of crops for this purpose. And at the heart of the garden was a sacred tree. Examples we have in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Siduri's vineyard with a sacred tree. In Sumer, Inanna's garden, also with a sacred tree. In Homer's Odyssey, we have Calypso's vineyard. In Greek mythology, the Garden of the Hesperides, it's an orchard there. And also in Greece, Dodona sanctuary, which had a sacred oak tree. And now, for the Hebrew goddess, Asherah, she's now established in the mainstream scholarship. She originated in Mesopotamia, and in Canaan she became El's wife, and then she was inherited by Yahweh when El and Yahweh merged after Yahweh came into Palestine. That the Hebrew Bible mentions Asherah and Asherah poles about 40 times. Most references are to the wooden pole, the cult object that symbolized Asherah and bore her name. However, several references shown here on the slide clearly refer to Asherah the goddess. There's also significant extra-biblical evidence of Asherah in Syria and Palestine over the many centuries from the late Bronze Age well into the Iron Age. I can't go through everything, but I'll focus here on some of the inscriptions and some of the iconography. The first inscription is from a place southwest of Jerusalem, and here you see a rich man or governor named Uriah. There's a blessing here, and it involves Yahweh and his Asherah, quote unquote. Here, Yahweh appears to be utilizing Asherah's cult object, the Asherah pole, thus drawing on the goddess's powers in addition to his own. Now we have more interesting ones from the Sinai. The first of these, which I've highlighted in red, is an important link because in Samaria, which was the capital of northern kingdom of Israel, now on the West Bank, an Asherah pole stood in Yahweh's own sanctuary, just as one stood in front of the Jerusalem temple for most of its existence. That is, in front of Solomon's temple, there was an Asherah pole about 2/3 of the time. So Yahweh and Asherah were seen as being paired in Samaria too. So the takeaways so far. She's paired with Yahweh. She's present with Yahweh in his sanctuaries. And so we might expect that the two would appear in the Garden of Eden too. But Jay opposes Asherah, wants to get rid of her. Yahweh has to appropriate her powers. And the garden has to be shown to be Yahweh's sanctuary, not the goddess's, as was historically the case. Okay, let's move to sacred trees. Here I have to explain a little bit. The reason why trees were considered sacred, at least the large and important trees, is that they represented the cosmos. In the ancient world, the cosmos had 3 tiers to it. There's the earthly level where we all live, the surface of the land. Then there's the underworld, the netherworld, which is a divine realm. And then there's heaven, which of course is another divine realm. And the trees are unique because their roots stretch down into the ground, into the divine netherworld, and they reach up to the sky, to the divinities there. And therefore, they're considered to be conduits of divinity. And you could contact with the divinities by venerating the sacred trees. So trees also, in harmony with the season, embody the life energy and symbolize the generation, regeneration, and renewal of life. And therefore, they get associated most closely with the goddess. And accordingly, they were venerated here in Palestine too. Now, I'm going to show you some of the archaeology here. Here we have what we call the tree or branch goddess, showing the association between the goddess and the trees. There she's holding the branches, and you see her underwear is actually made out of the branches too. Over here, similar thing. This is a Hathor, but in the Egyptian goddess Hathor, headdress or hairstyle. But it's really the Canaanite goddess with that hairstyle. And you can see here, out of her pubic area grows the trees. Shows the connection between the trees and life. Here again is the tree goddess in Egypt. Just another picture of the same thing that I showed you before. This is important because the tree is really representing life force and the understanding that I went through before. And the goats here, or caprids, are in a way, they're partaking of the goddess by eating the fruit. and they are venerating her at the same time. Now here we go. This is from Canaan, a city, a coastal city called Ugarit. This is actually Asherah, most scholars think. And same thing, the animals on each side venerating her. She's in the place of the tree that we saw in the prior slide. So the symbols are actually interchangeable. And here she's holding sheaves of wheat or barley, so she's being connected with the vegetation too. Now this one's interesting too. There's a ur here and a smaller goblet here found at the same site at about the same, from the same stratum. Here is interesting because you see the caprids on either side. There's a tree, and over top it says Elat, which means the goddess. It's an epithet. So you can see that that's kind of a caption for the goddess represented by the tree. And over here, the same thing, the two caprids, but look what's there. The goddess's pubic triangle. Here's from one of the inscriptions I showed you before in the Sinai. Here we have sacred tree again, caprids on her lion. And this is interesting because the image and this inscription go together. We don't know that the same person did it, but whoever was second was making the connection here between Yahweh of Samaria as Asherah and the image. All right, let's move to the serpent. Serpent symbolism the world over is very complicated, but for now I want to focus on the fact that serpents have positive and negative, or good and evil aspects. In the ancient Near East, the serpent was actually mostly good. He represented the creative divine force, the life energy, kind of like the Force in Star Wars. The serpent was venerated, therefore, as divine in Palestine and elsewhere. It also lives underground in the earth, like the earth goddess herself, and it accesses and lives in the divine plane of the netherworld. It guards trees and is associated with their roots. The serpent sheds its skin and hibernates, so it's also a symbol of renewal. In fact, the shedded skin is used in religious rituals, especially for fertility. Serpents are also associated with divination and are sources of knowledge and wisdom. In Hebrew, the noun for serpent, nahash, connotes divination, and the verb nahash means to practice divination or observe signs. Therefore, there's a connection with the transmission of knowledge of good and evil with a serpent in the Eden story. And so the sacred tree, when it is a conduit for the divine power, it's really thought of as serpent power. The serpent also has some evil connotations because it can represent the unrestrained aspect of the divine force, and that's typical of primordial chaos, which is evil. Therefore, in creation myths, often a serpent dragon is fought and defeated by the creator god so that the ordered cosmos, which is good, can be created. Let's call it dragon fight motif. And the evil serpent just happens to be a serpent goddess most of the time, or at least her proxy. So in the Eden story, the serpent connoted chaos and symbolized the chaos that was going on in Eve's own heart. Some more images here. In Egyptian, actually, the hieroglyph for goddess is a serpent, or the determinative at least. And here again in Egypt, we have Isis and Nephthys being represented as serpents. Again, the front part of the serpent is erect. And here, this is from Babylon. And again, here we see our Trinity. See, goddess, serpent, sacred tree. Note that the serpent is standing erect on its tail. This means that the divine energy is flowing through it. Just think of Kundalini. In the ancient Near East, the good serpent is usually portrayed in an erect posture like this, whereas the evil serpent is usually horizontal. We see both in the Eden story. At first, the serpent is somehow erect in its traditional posture when talking with Eve, more or less at eye level, but then it's flattened by Yahweh as its punishment. So here's some more associations of the goddess and serpent. This is from Crete. This is a pretty famous snake goddess. Now, this is the same lady we saw before in the prior image, okay? It's Asherah, flanked by the animals, but look what she's holding now. It's serpents, not the wheat. Here's Asherah again. This time, she's holding the animals, the two animals. And look, the serpents are flowing through her reproductive area. Again, the connection between the goddess and the serpents and fertility. And here are two examples of serpents symbolizing the divine powers inhering in and flowing through the sacred tree. On the left, the foliage is depicted in the form of the erect Egyptian cobra, called the uraeus. And on the right, we have the seated goddess on the bottom here, and that's in the form of a uraeus. And there are actual uraea above the tree, and here is the head of the goddess, Hathor/Asherah. So we have the Trinity again. All right, let's talk about Eve as a goddess figure. One reason we think this is because she's given the title or epithet of Mother of All Living in the story, Yom Kol Chai in Hebrew. And this is actually an honorific title of a goddess, because there are parallel epithets used for a lot of the other goddesses in the ancient Near East. The second reason is that Eve's actual name, Chava in Hebrew, means to live. As you can see, this word is related to other Hebrew and Semitic words connoting serpents and life. And in light of what we've been discussing, this ties here to the goddess. Finally, Eve symbolizing the goddess is corroborated by the Phoenician goddess Tanit, who is a variation on Asherah. Specifically, Tanit's name, like Eve's, is related to the word for serpent. Also, her epithet, Chava, is related to Eve's name, Chava, and likewise connotes life. Given these connections, the fact that Tanit is associated with both life and serpents helps connect Eve to the goddess. Okay, now I think we can sum up, having reviewed the symbols. The fall in the Eden story is actually not the one that we're familiar with. Rather, it's the fall of the goddess and her symbols. In the story, Jay changed the traditional meanings of these symbols in order to divorce Yahweh and Asherah and send her into oblivion. There are 4 points to make in summary. First, as to the sacred trees, Jay has linked the sacred trees with the serpent and the goddess using the traditional mythological imagery, this trinity. The tree of knowledge of good and evil is rejected because that points to Canaanites experiencing divinity through sacred tree veneration, which Jay hates. On the other hand, Yahweh claims the tree of life. At the end of the story, his cherubim and sword guard it. And we can see that kind of thinking reflected later on in Hosea, where Yahweh is talking and he says, hey, I'm your evergreen cypress. From me comes your fruit. So he's claiming all these aspects of divinity himself. Second, as for the serpent in the story is cursed and made the lowest of all animals. Now it crawls on its belly and eats dust. This may be the echo of the dragon fight myth that I mentioned earlier. Serpents and humans also are made enemies at the end of the story. This is anti-Canaanite polemic designed to prevent dangerous veneration of serpents and break up the Canaanite cultic partners of woman and serpent. The ground outside the garden is cursed. Traditionally, earth was the chthonic province of the serpent and the goddess, who together made it fertile. Yahweh takes over this function and created the plants in the garden himself. So the symbolism, again, is that Yahweh is in control. So the serpent's deprived of all divinity and therefore should not be venerated. Third, the goddess is demythologized. Yahweh, not the goddess, is the creator. Eve, goddess, is created by Yahweh, emerges from the male human, and is made of his substance. The creative roles are reversed. Also, the goddess is infertile. Eve needs Yahweh's help to conceive in Genesis 4:1. Also, Eve will have pregnancy and birth in pain, whereas in the ancient Near East, goddesses did so without pain. Next, Eve's actions parallel the serpent's. The serpent convinces her, and she likewise lures her male into pagan worship. Finally, Adam's fault is listening to Eve in order to attain divine qualities. This may be an allusion to goddess veneration, Jay saying not to venerate her. This is one reason, I think, for the woman's supplication to the man at the end of the story. Finally, with respect to the garden, Yahweh creates and plants it. The goddess is nowhere around in this process. Yahweh's in control of the goddess's former precinct. At the end, chaos is eliminated in the garden. But outside the garden, the cosmos is tainted with some chaos, which will grow, snowball throughout the primeval history, culminating in Noah's flood, after which the curse on the ground is removed. So now this leads us into topic 2, which, as I said, is what's the nature of the knowledge of good and evil and of Adam and Eve's transgression. Here, we need to start at the beginning, at the creation. In the biblical world, there was no such thing as creation from nothing. Rather, there was always a pre-existing primordial substance that was chaotic, not in the sense that it was necessarily violent, although it was at times, but in the sense that it was formless and lacked order. Ancient peoples thought of creation not as bringing any new substance into being, but as bringing pre-existing substance into order, which brought about multiplicity, time, rational space, cause and effect, and distinctions, especially opposites. The creation of something was complete only when the creator gave it a name, connoting its nature, purpose, function, and destiny. So, Adam's name came from the Hebrew Adamah, meaning ground or earth, because he was made of the ground and was destined to till the soil. Eve's name, as we've seen, connoted life. In the Eden story, the pre-existing chaos was depicted as a desert wasteland called Eden, and the garden was placed in the middle of that. In the Hebrew Bible and other ancient texts, chaos is often described as a desert, a manifestation of chaos. So, as one biblical scholar put it, in Genesis 1, chaos is pictured as a sea, in Genesis 2, as a desert. So here's what you end up with once the cosmos is created. It's like the 3 tiers. We have the heaven, space, the atmosphere, land, and then the chaotic waters are below and above. It surrounds the cosmos, which is really kind of like a bubble in the middle of, or an island in the middle of the chaotic waters, which continue to exist. So we can see here what the priestly author meant in Genesis 1 when he said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." As a result, the orderly chaos let me start again. The cosmos exists as this bubble or island, and that's kind of what happened when the creation was undone in Noah's flood, because the waters came in from the top and bottom, and the ark and Noah and the animals really existed in this small, tiny bubble, and the creation was undone all around it. Why did creation myths conceive of a creation as order emerging from chaos? It's actually an example of how myths have emerged from our psyche. Psychologists such as Marie-Louise von France argue that this is a natural result of our psyche experiencing its own ego consciousness coming into being as quote-unquote world becoming. That is, from the perspective of our psyche, our becoming aware of the world and the world coming into existence are one and the same. The process occurred not only when early humans first developed ego consciousness, but this also occurs, as developmental psychology shows, in any young child's psychological development, as well as in the daily life of adults, like when we wake up in the morning. Every time we transition from an unconscious state into waking ego consciousness, we experience the orderly elements of the world falling into place: time, space, cause and effect, etc. Thus, the dawn of consciousness and the creation of the world are parallel and related processes which throw up the same symbolism. The emergence of ego-consciousness projects itself in cosmic form. The cosmogonic myths thus portray the coming of this consciousness through corresponding symbols. Our unconscious has little sense of space of time, therefore little sense of order. It is indeed chaotic and is experienced as such. Hence, water is a well-known archetypal symbol for the unconscious. Thus, the notion of a primordial chaotic waters is a natural archetypal symbolic projection of an image that helps make the unknown comprehensible. Only our conscious ego can put order into the initially chaotic content of our psyches, meaning quite literally that, from the perspective of our psyche, the creation and the outside world can occur only when and as we cross the border from unconsciousness into ego consciousness. Now, this creation, unfortunately, is inherently unstable. Chaos is never eliminated, as I showed on the diagram. It's always trying to infiltrate and disrupt the cosmos. As one professor put it, quote, "The confinement of chaos rather than its elimination is the essence of creation, and the survival of ordered reality hangs only upon God's vigilance in ensuring that those cosmic dikes do not fail. The world is not inherently safe, it is inherently unsafe." Chaos is usually symbolized by the serpent dragon, as I mentioned before, which is vanquished during the creation. So when the serpent appears in the garden, the audience knows that the chaos has appeared and is threatening the orderly creation in the garden. The serpent and Eve's dialogue with it, as reflected in the imaginings of her mind, are representative of the chaos that has erupted in her own mind. Since in these creation stories nothing is fully created until a deity has given it a name, destiny, and purpose, the elements of the cosmos have a teleological or purposeful nature. In Adam's case, as mentioned, his purpose and destiny, and hence that of humankind, was linked with the earth itself. Adam's decreed task was both to cultivate and guard and preserve the garden. In cosmic terms, this is an assignment to create, to preserve, and further develop the divinely created order. And this is exactly what he and Eve failed to do. This teleological character of the creation and its instability sets up a conflict between chaos and order. God wants order, which is good, which is why he so characterized his creations in Genesis 1. Chaos threatens order and therefore is evil. The battle between order and chaos thus has a normative character. In ancient times, when chaos erupted on Earth in the form of earthquakes, destructive storms, tsunamis, and so forth, people considered them evil because they create disorder and to some extent undo the creation. This dynamic has implications for human conduct. Humans must behave consistently with God's created order and desires. Acting in a way that increases chaos is wrongful and is the essence of sin. Sin is literally the manifestation of chaos in human conduct. It's a cosmic phenomenon. So this cosmic battle between chaos and order naturally goes on within our psyches. This follows from how we are made. Specifically, when Adam was being formed from the earth, order did not yet exist on earth, only chaos. The garden did not yet exist. Adam was created from the substance of the chaotic Eden, the wasteland, before the garden existed, and he was created as a combination of the chaotic desert wasteland soil and the chaotic primordial waters from the underworld, which Yahweh had just caused to spurt to the surface. Therefore, humans, just like other elements of the cosmos, naturally have an element of chaos within themselves. Now here I have to get a little technical, sorry. Jay gives this human element of chaos a designation, Yetzer in Hebrew, which is a feature of our own nature even from youth. The latter verse on the screen, Genesis 8:21, is important because Yahweh says this at the end of Noah's flood, when he's resigning himself to the fact that humans have this trait by nature and therefore covenants with Noah never to flood the earth again. The noun Yetzer comes from the verb Yetzar, which is used to describe Yahweh's forming both Adam and the animals from the ground. Thus, Yetzer literally means that which is formed or made. Accordingly, this inclination or impulse toward evil in ourselves is literally a formation within human nature. That is, within our psyche. This accounts for the latter rabbinical doctrine of the human natural inclination or impulse to evil called the Yetzer Hara. Ra is evil in Hebrew. In Judaism, this became the standard explanation for the origin and continuation of evil in the world, which of course is at odds with the Christian explanation of original sin, but is consistent with the approach I'm using here. Specifically, this element of chaos existed from our very beginning, at Adam's creation, which is to say, before the transgression in the garden. Anticipating a bit, in my modern psychological terms, we can begin to see how this chaos consists of unconscious content, especially shadow content, manifesting itself in the behavior of humans. The failure to control the chaos in oneself results in sin and increases chaos in the external world. The sins of humans can actually infect the entire world. This is what happened between Cain's sin, the first sin, on my view, and Noah's flood. Chaos snowballed until Yahweh was fed up and decided to start over by cleansing with the flood. But then the same thing started happening. Noah's drunkenness, Canaan's curse, Tower of Babel, and so forth. So, what's the remedy then? What to do? Well, Jay and the other biblical authors thought the solution was twofold. First, we need the knowledge of good and evil. This allows us to control chaos and avoid sin. But as the primeval history showed, this in itself is not sufficient. Humans left on our own are still not up to the task, and therefore a second element from Yahweh is needed, which is to create and impose the law, requiring the Hebrews to follow it. The law is a form of order, designed for humans to control chaos. But in order to understand and follow the law, the knowledge of good and evil must be applied. You need the knowledge to understand the law, so the two work together. So let's have a look. What does the knowledge of good and evil really consist of? What does it mean? There's been a lot of uncertainty over what the knowledge of good and evil really is, but in the Hebrew Bible, actually, it's explained pretty well, and it doesn't have anything to do with sex. Sorry. The description begins in the Eden story, actually, where this knowledge is first acquired. So let's look there, and it's on the handout. When Eve saw that the tree of knowledge of good and evil was there, she recognized that's when she recognized that she wanted to be wise. That was her principal interest in it. And then once she and Adam ate the forbidden fruit, the eyes of both of them were open and they knew certain things. That's what the text says. And then observing what happened, Yahweh remarks, "Behold, the man has become like one of us, gods, knowing good and evil." This means that such godlike knowledge included wisdom and an ability to perceive, discern, and distinguish. I'm sorry, I don't know why some of those titles are so small. Something happened here on the computer. Anyway, the Hebrew Bible then goes on to explain more specifically what the knowledge of good and evil is. And what it refers to men reaching an age of maturity at which they're deemed to, quote unquote, know good and evil, and therefore may assume adult roles and responsibilities. Isaiah 7:14-16 describes a stage in the growth of a child before he, quote, before he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, unquote. Similarly, rules in Hebrew law refer to the age of 20 as when men acquire certain rights and responsibilities, such as performing military service, giving offerings to Yahweh, and paying taxes. This is exemplified by when Yahweh caused the children of Israel in the wilderness in Sinai as punishment for doubting and murmuring against him. This punishment was imposed only on people 20 years of age and older, because only they were deemed capable of and responsible for sin. This interpretation is confirmed in Deuteronomy 139, which refers to these same exempted young people as those who, quote, have no knowledge of good and evil, unquote. Likewise, the Dead Sea Scrolls, in outlining the rules for a young man entering the congregation at Qumran, state that such entry shall occur when, quote, he is 20 years of age, when he knows good and evil, unquote. Then he can take his place among the men of the clan, join the congregation, have intercourse with women, and thus marry. In conclusion, the knowledge of good and evil is achieved at the stage of maturity at which one has the wisdom and discernment to understand and follow the law and tell right from wrong, and therefore the ability to sin or not. In legalistic terms, the knowledge of good and evil is functionally equivalent to our modern legal principle of having legal capacity, without which one is not legally responsible for one's actions, like in the case of children and minors. Kings, as leaders, must have the highest level of knowledge of good and evil, at least when they are to be good kings. And this is exemplified best by David and Solomon, whose wisdom is specifically described as the godlike ability to distinguish between good and evil. Solomon prayed for this wisdom. He got it from Yahweh, and that's when we had the episode of the splitting of the baby, if you recall. Okay. In conclusion, on this topic, in the Israelite understanding, Adam and Eve's transgression was not the cause of the sinful nature of humans, as in the Christian doctrine of original sin. Rather, the transgression was the natural result of such nature that had existed from the moment of human creation, in circumstances when human behavior was not yet subject to control by the knowledge of good and evil. Humans gaining such knowledge is what made it possible for Yahweh to warn Cain about sin, as mentioned above, which was the first mention of sin in the Hebrew Bible. The presumed ability of Cain to understand and master sin assumes his knowledge of good and evil. Yahweh could not have said this to Adam and Eve because they would not have understood it. As Martin Buber explained, quote, the deed of the first humans belonged to the sphere of pre-evil, Cain's deed to that of evil, which only came into being as such through the act of knowledge, unquote. But once humans acquired such knowledge, they had a meaningful power of choice and the responsibility to exercise that choice in favor of the good. So, the symbol of primordial chaos and creationness is really a projection of our own chaotic unconscious, while the mythological motif of creation as a process of imposing order reflects our own coming into ego consciousness, a self-aware knowing of the outside world. As such, Adam and Eve's eyes being open upon gaining the knowledge of good and evil and immediately being able to see opposites, and also that nakedness is not good, symbolizes their transition from an archaic, undifferentiated psychic unity to a higher level. Through this transformation, humans became able to make subject-object distinctions, distinguish themselves in relation to the outside world, and perceive and understand the world in terms of opposites. This means not just those of good and evil as in the story, but all opposites. This transformation brings us from a childlike state to maturity, where we are fully human and, among other things, can understand Yahweh and His law. It is the completion of our creation, after which we can literally walk out of the garden. Just like the children of the wilderness when they were mature enough and ready to enter the promised land. At this stage, at this point, we might ask, well, why wasn't this knowledge already downloaded into humans at creation? That seems to be the case in Genesis 1. Why do we have to go through all this? To answer this, we have to look at the transgression from Jay's literary and rhetorical perspective, having in mind the narrative arc of the primeval history for which Jay was mainly responsible. First, I think it was important for Jay to depict to his audience the raw, chaotic human nature and what happens when this nature takes its natural course before the arrival of the corrective knowledge. Second, it was important that Adam and Eve themselves learned their lesson the hard way, so that they could experience firsthand both the pure chaos within themselves, which is evil, and then the coming of the corrective knowledge. This enables the audience to feel the same dynamic within themselves. Thus, a transgression was helpful for literary and rhetorical purposes. And secondly, here, as I mentioned, the second element of the remedy is the coming of the law. As one scholar put it, quote, God has given humans an instruction manual for life on planet Earth so that they can partner with God in the management of chaos. So we can summarize what's going on as a cosmic principle here. I made this diagram. We have the cosmic level above, the human level below that are on Earth. And at the highest cosmic level, we have good, which is form, okay? Evil is chaos. And then each of them can relate to the humans at the bottom level. And so at the human level, good is illustrated by the law of Moses, and evil is sin, which is caused by the chaos erupting within us and our not using our knowledge and not following the law. So the relevance of this story today, I have a chapter about that in the book, but I'll mention just a couple of things here. The Eden story ends up being one about the elevation of human consciousness, not a fall. The garden was really a metaphor for our minds. Having the knowledge of good and evil is a necessary and a good thing, not a bad thing, just as it was described in the rest of the Bible, as I went through. In effect, once gaining this higher knowledge, consciousness, Adam and Eve were prepared to walk out of the garden on their own, not to be expelled. The implication is that we should continue to elevate ourselves in a disciplined way that avoids hubris. I hope that this talk has helped show that just because a myth is not factually true, it can still teach us a lot about history and about ourselves. Thank you.
Questions?
Yeah, let's take two questions. I think your hand was up first. Go ahead.
Yeah, the question is, do we have any information about the historical period in which J and P were doing the writing? Do we have any information?
That continues to be controversial. What I would say is that the authors keep getting newer. In other words, they appear at a later stage. And in the case of J, it was thought that he wrote, scholars used to think he wrote like during the time of Solomon, but I think that's not true anymore. I date mid-9th century BC, because that's when literacy crept in. There wasn't enough literacy going on in the 10th century. And that's also a period when the bigger and more prosperous state of the northern kingdom of Israel dominated Jerusalem. And that's how a lot of the literacy came in. And so a lot of what Jay's talking about is really a rhetoric against not only ancient Canaan, but the northern kingdom of Israel, which is still really the Canaanites, as I mentioned. So I date him in the 9th century, and some scholars date him even later. And P probably came about 2 centuries after J, but still before the exile. Yes?
This question, similar to the one that's asked, is about the timing of this interpretation of ascension vis-a-vis the Prometheus myth of the Greeks, which is similar.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know how far back the Prometheus myth went. I'm not convinced that there was actually contact between the cultures, that, where one would have gotten the story from the other. I take the more psychological approach, that this kind of notion of people wanting to become like gods and have a more elevated sense of being and consciousness is a psychological fact. So the myths get generated by the psychology. Yes?
How important do you think getting out knowledge about these things is to combat the literalism and fundamentalism that brings about stuff like Canaan
Yeah, you put your finger on a good point here. I think yeah, that's a good illustration of how we can use our knowledge, because the knowledge of good and evil is this rise in ego consciousness, which is a way to control ourselves and how to use reason. Okay, and when we see this kind of fundamentalism and people digging in their heels, it's not because of them using their reason. It's because it's coming from inside. Something's going on inside their psyche, which is dominating their thinking and their conduct. Okay, and that's kind of what was happening at the beginning of the Eden story and the transgression. They didn't have the knowledge yet, and so they were just doing stuff by instinct. You know, they didn't understand the prohibition against eating the fruit. I mean, they understood the words, but they didn't really know what it meant. And so when you see the fundamentalists acting the way they are, yeah, it's a pretty good example of not applying the knowledge that we have. Yes.
Maybe I'm still getting caught up in the literalism of the story, but I guess what is the metaphorically speaking, why is death the consequence for gaining consciousness, human consciousness, or gaining knowledge? Why is it represented as something deserving of death?
Yeah, good question. The snake, I don't know if you can hear the question. It's about how's the idea of death in the story connected with what I'm talking about. In the story, the serpent says, once you eat the fruit, you will die. Okay? And there's a literalist, yeah, I'm going to really physically die. And that turns out not to be true. The way I like to look at it is that it's more of like an initiation scenario. So that what dies is the former human that was without the knowledge. And you enter into a new state of being. So the old you is gone, the new you has just been born. In the back, in the gray shirt, that's you with the count.
When God said, when man will become like us, is us a reference to his wife, Asherah? Yahweh and Asherah, or is it?
Probably not. I mean, Jay's writing this, and he doesn't want Yahweh to have anything to do with Asherah, okay? But in the Hebrew Bible, it wasn't a pure monotheism. Yahweh was viewed as the sole divinity legitimately worthy of worship by the Israelites, okay? It doesn't mean that there were no other divine beings around. So this goes back to the Canaanite mythology, because in ancient Canaan, the chief god El had his council of deities around him. It was like holding a council. And so that's how they decided things. And or at least the chief god informed the other gods, the angels and whatever, what he was going to do. And so the references here in Genesis, in the Eden story, and also another one in Genesis 1, I think is a legacy of the Canaanite mythology. Yes?
How does Adam's first wife, Lilith, play into this?
That's a good question. It goes back to making sure that we distinguish between the two stories, Genesis 1 story and the Eden story. Remember, the Eden story was written first, probably by some 200 years, okay? And clearly in that story, there's only one woman. It's Eve, and she comes out of Adam. The only way you get an idea of another woman hanging around, somebody there first, is because the way in which the two creation stories were ordered in the Bible. You get Genesis 1 first, and what does that say? That there were these humans created by God all at the same time. So that means there's one woman. And so when people started reading these two stories together, they say, oh, well, there was a woman before Eve, because they mentions women in Genesis 1. And so that's how the notion of another woman, which ended up becoming Lilith, came about. And then you can spin all kinds of stories off of that. But the thing the thing to keep in mind here is that Genesis 1 story was not around when Jay wrote the Eden story. So that was not even a glimmer in his eye at the time. And so we shouldn't use any of these stories about Lilith in order to interpret Eden's story, because that was the first. Yes?
I find it amazing how many people say there's no contradictions in the Bible when it's stories of Genesis that contradict each other.
Yeah, that's why I always mentioned it in my presentations, that there's these two stories and you have to keep it straight. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna be, the hook is coming here. So I'm gonna, thanks for your attention, and I'll be at my table, you can find me.
Thank you, Arthur George. Fascinating stuff. I've long thought that that's exactly what the metaphor meant, and thank you for confirming that I was right. Yeah. Fantastic. We're going to take a 15-minute break now, and there's restrooms to the right and to the left through the lobby. Get a snack, get a cookie, get a soda, come back at 11 o'clock sharp, 4-man pizza time. Thank you.